Russia has told the United Nations that it will not use nuclear weapons against NATO or Ukraine unless its existence is threatened. Now, as the pressure piles up against Russia and Putin, could things come to a stage where Russia is forced to fire a nuclear warning shot at Ukraine? What would that trigger? Take a look at this exclusive visual simulation using real-time data of what the world would look like and what would transfer. Take a look. Aggravated by the global escalation against his invasion of Ukraine, Vladimir Putin has amplified the nuclear threat, placing the world's biggest nuclear weapons arsenal on operational alert and putting the world on notice. But what would happen if Putin decided to push the nuclear button? What would happen to the world? It's an unthinkable question. But 3 years before the invasion, a group of scientists at Princeton University's program on science and global security created a data-centered simulation with actual targets, actual warheads, and actual plans. It begins very much with what we're seeing already, a battle between Russia and a Ukraine that's armed and trained by NATO and the US. What you're about to see is what would happen if Putin is pushed to the limit. First, Putin fires a tactical nuclear warhead as a warning shot to jolt NATO into the fact that he means nuclear business. Rattled by the crossing of that nuclear threshold, NATO immediately fires back a nuclear tactical missile to destroy the Russian launch site. This triggers a big tactical nuclear war in Europe. Russia dramatically escalates by launching 300 nuclear warheads via aircraft and short-range ballistic missile to hit NATO bases and military units around Europe. NATO returns fire, firing back with 180 nuclear warheads at Russian targets. The crossfire and impact of the nuclear attack engulfs all of Europe, practically destroying the continent, with an initial casualty figure of 2.6 million in just 3 hours. With Europe destroyed, the United States steps in, launching as many as 600 intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads from land and sea at Russia. With the US nuclear missiles still in the air, Russia launches all available intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads at the United States before its own launch sites are destroyed. This phase will create as many as 3.4 million casualties. And in the final phase, with the aim of inhibiting each other's recovery, Russia and NATO target each other's most populous cities and economic centers with 5 to 10 nuclear warheads each, depending on their population. This phase could cause as many as 85.3 million casualties. So in less than 5 hours, with the use of over 2,500 nuclear weapons, this nuclear war could cause 34.1 million fatalities and injure over 57.4 million. And that's just in the immediate part of the war. It is clear that nuclear conflict will destroy the world, and this simulation, juxtaposed with what's happening between Russia and NATO, reminds the world how close the end could be. Bureau Report, India Today. Conflict in Ukraine. One of the most disturbing running themes through the conflict in Ukraine so far has been an explicitly stated threat of a nuclear escalation by Russia. They've described it as a response to an existential threat from NATO, but it has the world on the highest levels of nuclear alert in a very long time. A video simulation created by a group of scientists in 2019, 3 years before this war, is now seen to have had a terrifying premonition of an unthinkable worst-case scenario in this current conflict in Ukraine. A simulation done on computers that literally shows how Russia could trigger a global nuclear war if cornered by NATO? And joining me live from the United States is Zia Mian. He's a nuclear physicist. He's co-director of the Princeton Program on Science and Global Security. He's a world-renowned scholar on nuclear disarmament. Of the many things he has contributed to in his academic life is an unsettling simulation that we will be putting on your screens in just a moment. Zia Mian, it's a privilege to have you here on India Today. Thank you for your time and thank you for being with us. The first question I'd like to ask you, Zia, is in the current context of what you're seeing between Russia and NATO, did it immediately remind you of that simulation that you were part of in 2019?
Not really. What we were simulating then was what we believe to be the structural logic of war plans by Russia, NATO, and the United States. And so these are the two war machines that the two sides have built. So we just worked through the logic of the machines rather than any particular assumption about any particular situation. So I think that what we were seeing then could have happened at any time because of the war plans that both sides have and the preparations that they have made to exercise those plans.
Has it become much more realistic now? Because, you know, in the few weeks since this invasion, you've seen Russia elevate the operational levels of its nuclear arsenal. You've heard, Putin's ministers speak repeatedly of the possibility of nuclear warfare. It is being interpreted as a lot of saber rattling and signaling and muscle flexing. But has that made this nightmare scenario that you've simulated much more recognizable and real?
I think that what we've seen Russia doing, where President Putin threatened consequences the like of which you have never seen in your history, he said, this is part of the script of the nuclear age. It goes all the way back to President Truman and the use of atomic bombs against Japan, where he said in 1945, there will be a reign of ruin like you have never seen before. So nuclear weapon states say this because they can, because they have nuclear weapons. And people watching this will know that in our own region, in India and Pakistan, we have had exactly the same kind of saber rattling from both sides in the past. And so this is what nuclear weapon states do. So we should not be surprised that they go through this and that they issue threats. The threat of nuclear war always hangs over a nuclear armed state when it chooses to threaten and use force, because that's what their nuclear weapons are for. They say they are for deterrence, but that makes it sound like they're only defensive. We just sit here, we don't threaten anybody, so don't come after us. Whereas actually what they do is their weapons are a shield behind which they can wage wars of aggression and to threaten their neighbors and anybody else in pursuit of their interests. And we saw this throughout the Cold War, and now we're seeing it after the Cold War.
Okay, and you're seeing it in this new Cold War that's happening now as well. One of the startling things about this simulation, apart from the uncanny resonance it's having with, a possible nightmare scenario in the current context of what's happening in Ukraine, and we're going to play that simulation, is how it starts off with a nuclear warning shot, Zia. I want you to just talk us through that. A warning, what would make Russia fire a tactical nuclear warning shot of the kind that's been, described in your simulation? Because that's the trigger point for everything that follows.
Right. So it begins with conventional war. And at some point, Russia decides that it needs to send a message to NATO and the United States that the terms of the battle are not what Russia wants to see. So it uses a nuclear explosion to say, you have to stop and allow the battle to move in a direction that we wish. This has always been one role for nuclear weapons. Ever since tactical nuclear weapons were invented in the 1950s, the United States planned to use them first on the battlefield against Soviet tanks as a way to say, look, you have to stop now or else we will escalate further. The Russians use them. Pakistan threatens exactly the same thing when faced with Indian military conventional superiority. We will use a tactical nuclear weapon first. So this is part of the logic of nuclear war planning by states with nuclear weapons. And so we just said, But suppose Russia does this, because NATO does have much larger conventional military forces and capabilities. So we imagined a Russian first use to just say, stop now, or we go further. Now, what we also know is that US NATO war planning is to escalate in those circumstances.
Yes.
The former head of US Strategic Command,
yes,
who's in charge of all US nuclear weapons, actually is on the record that every single time the United States plays a nuclear war game, which they do every year,
yes,
it always escalates to all-out nuclear war, every time. So that includes circumstances in which Russia uses a tactical nuclear weapon. So their own experience in playing war games is that it always escalates in exactly the way that we describe to all-out nuclear war.
It's pretty terrifying, and I want to play the middle portion of this simulation once again, which is right after that tactical first nuclear strike by Russia. There is a counter strike by NATO, and then there's a sudden escalation in the number of attacks to try and take out these nuclear sites, and then it kind of escalates on to the United States. Can you talk us through, Zia, how fast this process is from that first warning shot that's fired, for things to escalate to the United States? How long would all of this take? Because we've got your simulation on our screens right now, and it's a very, very unsettling sequence.
So we assumed that after the first tactical use of nuclear weapons, which is a nuclear bomb dropped by a Russian airplane on a NATO site in Europe, and a retaliation by the United States using an airplane carrying a nuclear weapon to a site in Russia, that after that, the next phase of escalation lasts a couple of hours, because that's the time it takes for airplanes to load their bombs and fly all the way across Europe to destroy many NATO bases. And for European-based nuclear weapons, the United States has 100 nuclear weapons for use by airplanes at NATO bases in Europe. The United States is the only country that keeps its nuclear weapons in other countries. So we assumed those would be the NATO weapons that would be used under American command against sites in Russia. So that whole process takes a couple of hours. But then we move to attacks against their respective homelands, where the Russians launch nuclear weapons against the United States launches nuclear weapons from the US mainland and from nuclear-armed submarines against Russia, which is part of the US, what they call strategic triad.
Yes.
And that's then used, but they're targeting military sites. They're not trying to deliberately destroy cities or economic targets. They're targeting each other's nuclear weapons, because in the nuclear weapons age, you have to try and destroy the other side's nuclear weapons and military capacity as quickly as possible. Because if you don't, then those weapons will destroy you. And so the speed of war becomes very short. And the time it takes for a nuclear missile to travel from the United States to Russia is 30 minutes. From a nuclear submarine that the United States has in the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean to Russia is 15 minutes or less. And so that's the timescale in which the next phase of the war plays out.
And 91.5 million would be the death toll, which is the immediate effect of these weapons as part of your simulation after this series of attacks, exchanges?
Yes, when we did the calculations back then, those were the immediate casualties from the explosion and the fire. Right. We didn't include the effects of radiation and fallout and the clouds of radioactive poison that would be carried by the wind in all kinds of directions. And we also didn't include the effects of what is called nuclear winter. When cities burn, the smoke goes into the atmosphere and it goes above the clouds. And so then it can't come back down with the rain, and it stays there, and the surface of the earth will go dark because of the smoke. Yes. And the computer simulations that have modeled that, which use the same computer models we use for understanding climate change, so that smoke will stay in the atmosphere for perhaps 20 years, which means there will be a complete collapse of agriculture and natural ecosystems which depend on sunlight for plants to grow across large parts of the world. There will be a catastrophic collapse of food production all over the world.
Zia, final two questions. Russia has been pinned down with sanction after sanction. The Kremlin, Putin, they've been talking about how an existential threat to Russia would force them to perhaps, push the nuclear button. With everything you've seen so far happening in Russia, with things not quite going to Putin's plan as far as dominating Ukraine is concerned, the things NATO has been saying, Do you think it's possible? I don't want to make it broad, but do you think it's conceivable that a nuclear tactical warning shot could be fired in this current scenario?
It's not just conceivable, it is planned. Right? You have to remember, these are war plans as far as we understand them. That the Russian military political plan is that in some circumstances, we will use a nuclear weapon and keep using more and more nuclear weapons unless we get what we want, which is exactly the same plan that the United States has. It takes two sides to do this.
Yeah.
Right? There are two interlocking nuclear war machines. And each move by one machine makes the other machine do something. And it is this combination of one machine and the other machine connected together through war plans and political decision-making that drives this logic to these terrible outcomes. But we have exactly the same logic between Pakistan and India also.
Yeah.
And soon that same logic is developing between the United States and China. But this is what nuclear war looks like between nuclear-armed states. So we should always worry about this. And Shiv, the big thing to remember, it doesn't always have to begin deliberately. Nuclear war can begin by accident.
Yes.
We saw the recent missile that accidentally flew into Pakistan. You could imagine a Russian missile that accidentally flies across into NATO, or an American plane or a NATO weapon that accidentally ends up in Russia. So triggers can happen that neither side plans that right now we will do this. But in the chaos of battle, and the short times to respond, and the fear of nuclear war, because you have nuclear weapons, things can happen that no one expects to happen. But once they start, the machinery of mass destruction that they have built will unfold in its own logic.
Is the world, you're saying that these nuclear weapons placed on operational alert are part of war plans, not just the conceivable, but actually part of war plans. Does that mean that the world is currently on, a high state of nuclear alert with what Russia is doing, Zia?
The world is always on this alert. You have to remember that the American intercontinental ballistic missiles in submarines and in silos, and similarly with Russia, they are on order to be able to fire within minutes. The American intercontinental missiles are called Minuteman missiles because literally it takes minutes for them to fire, and they're always ready to go, right? It's just that we are now paying attention to them, but they are always in this state, ready to go. It only takes somebody to order that happening. So that's the politics of what's happening, but the machinery that makes it possible is always ready to go at a minute's notice.
Terrifying to even think about that. And one final question then in that case, Zia, because you've made this very real for all of us. In that simulation, that dramatic final, final sequence when the United States fires its intercontinental ballistic missiles, and we'll put that on our screen for our viewers, targeting Russia, and then Russia firing back, and then those final the counter value plan that actually takes place, a large part of the world appears to be destroyed. Is this something that could, I apologize if this is a simplistic question, but is this something that could basically destroy the entire world?
Oh, yes, certainly. And we've always known this.
Yeah.
When the President of the United States was first told about nuclear weapons in World War II, 1945, the Secretary of Defense met the President and said, "We have almost finished building the atomic bomb. This is a bomb that will hold all of civilization hostage." And they kept going and finished the bomb and then used it against Japan. So the fact that we have weapons that will end the world has always been part of it. And every country that makes nuclear weapons, including India and Pakistan, know that this is what these weapons are capable of doing.
You've given a lot of us a great deal of food for thought. This is something about, the very future of human existence. It's also really scary, to think of what you said, Zia, that let's remember that not every strike needs to be deliberate. It can be accidentally triggered. It can be a mistake. It can be, orchestrated. And these are really, really scary thoughts when you're talking about weapons that can truly end our lives and end the world. But I thank you for that. It serves as a warning to us all. I hope the world is listening. I know that you've been an advocate of disarmament for a very, very long time, and we will continue to put voices like yours here on our channel at this very difficult time. Zia Mia, it's been a privilege. Thank you very much for your time here on India Today.